Hi, my name is Lizzie Casciola, and I'm a research scientist here at HERC, the Houston Education Research Consortium, which is a research practice partnership between Rice University and 11 public school districts in the Houston area. Thanks for joining me as I present some recent results examining English learners, or ELs, who become long-term English learners, or LTELs, in elementary schools in the greater Houston area. Specifically, we examined whether campuses with a higher or lower percent of ELs who become LTELs are geographically clustered. We define a campus's percent of ELs who become LTEL as the percent of EL students who begin at an elementary campus and go on to become LTEL. In this study, we define a long-term English learner as an EL student who does not reclassify as English proficient after 5 years in school. Therefore, for each elementary school in the greater Houston area, we identify the number of students who began first grade, or year one, as ELs at each campus. The percent of ELs who did not reclassify 5 years later and began sixth grade as ELs made up the campus's percent of ELs who became LTEL. To preview our findings, the results point to a geographic divide in elementary schools with a higher and lower percent of ELs who become LTELs. Specifically, schools with a higher percent of ELs who become LTELs cluster in the central and eastern areas of Houston, and schools with a lower percent of ELs who become LTELs cluster in the western area of Houston. In addition, throughout the region, there are schools that are not clustered, meaning that they are surrounded by a mix of high and low LTEL schools. Exceptions to these clusters exist, with some lower LTEL campuses amidst higher LTEL campuses and some higher LTEL campuses amidst lower LTEL campuses. For this study, we examined 3 cohorts of EL students who began first grade between 2012 and 2014 at 649 public elementary campuses in 27 school districts in the greater Houston area. A campus's percent of ELs who become LTEL was calculated based on the students who started at that campus and remained in Texas public schools 5 years later. We used the geographic location of each campus to map campuses based on the percent of ELs who become LTELs. Then we examined spatial patterns to look for clusters of campuses with a similar percent of ELs who become LTELs. As mentioned previously, 27 public school districts in the Houston area were included in this study. In this map, our school district partners participating in the LTEL study are highlighted in pink, and their neighboring districts are highlighted in yellow. This map provides an overview of where low, medium, and high LTEL campuses are located. Low LTEL campuses, represented by the yellow dots, are defined as campuses with 30% or fewer ELs who go on to become LTEL. Medium LTEL campuses, represented by the orange dots, are defined as campuses with 31 to 62% of ELs who go on to become LTEL. And high LTEL campuses, represented by the red dots, are defined as campuses with 63% or more ELs who go on to become LTEL. As you can see in this map, low, medium, and high LTEL campuses are scattered across the region. Every district has some variation in low to medium, medium to high, or low, medium, and high LTEL schools. In this map, we are showing you the results from the cluster analysis, which asks whether high or low LTEL schools are neighboring each other. As shown in the legend, the red dots indicate schools who belong to a cluster of higher LTEL schools. The blue dots indicate schools who belong to a cluster of lower LTEL schools. Different shades of blue and red indicate the certainty that a campus belongs to a cluster. And finally, the small gray dots show schools who are not part of a cluster. Here, we provide some examples of what a cluster might look like. Up here, we are zooming in on a small area of the higher LTEL cluster. These are all schools who have a medium to high percent of ELs who become LTELs and are geographically clustered. Down here, we are zooming in on a small area of the lower LTEL cluster, and these are all schools who have a low percent of ELs who become LTEL and are geographically clustered. As you can see, there are clusters of high LTEL schools in central and eastern Houston and clusters of low LTEL schools in western Houston. Areas without clusters, shown by the small gray dots, had a mix of high and low LTEL campuses. So this band of schools in between the two clusters has a mix of high and low LTEL schools neighboring each other. As you can see here, clusters of schools with a higher percent of ELs who become LTELs are mostly located in the central and eastern part of the region. This cluster includes parts of Houston ISD, Spring Branch ISD, Klein ISD, Aldine ISD, Sheldon ISD, Pasadena ISD, and 5 neighboring districts. In addition, clusters of schools with a lower percent of ELs who become LTELs are mostly located in the further west part of the region. This cluster includes parts of Katy ISD, Cypress-Fairbanks ISD, Klein ISD, Alief ISD, and 4 neighboring districts. In addition to looking at clusters, we identified outlier schools, or schools that have LTEL percentages different from their neighbors. This map shows that in both of the major clusters, there are outlier campuses. There are higher LTEL schools surrounded by lower LTEL schools. These campuses are represented by red dots that are found amongst the light blue dots. In addition, there are lower LTEL schools surrounded by higher LTEL schools. These campuses are represented by the dark blue dots among the light pink dots. You can see that there are many outlier campuses, particularly in the higher LTEL cluster. Here we provide an example of these outliers. At the top, we are zooming in on a group of campuses that include 2 outliers. These campuses have a higher LTEL rate than their neighboring campuses. At the bottom, we are zooming in on a group of campuses that includes 1 outlier. This campus has a lower LTEL rate than its neighbors. To summarize, elementary schools do tend to cluster by the percent of ELs who go on to become LTEL, specifically with a cluster of higher LTEL schools in the central and eastern areas of Houston, and a cluster of lower LTEL schools in the western area. Importantly, there are campuses that are outliers to this trend, including many campuses in the higher LTEL cluster who are showing lower LTEL rates than their neighbors. In further research, we are going to examine how campuses in the 2 clusters differ in terms of campus characteristics. We will also look at characteristics of outlier campuses compared to their neighbors to better understand what is happening at these campuses. Finally, we plan to publish an online interactive dashboard where our district partners can look at each of these campuses, their characteristics, and their percent of ELs to become LTELs. We hope that this will be helpful information to guide questions around practices at campuses that are bright spots, as well as campuses that may need additional support. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, Lizzie Casciola, at the email address on the screen. We look forward to sharing additional results from the LTEL study with you soon.